friends. So today we're talking about David Hume. So you read from your free will text a selection from Hume that comes from the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Now, just a little bit of background. As I mentioned before, Hume was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. And what we find in the reading for today is we find Hume defending a pair of theses, right? The first one is that we do in fact have free will, and the second is that we are determined, right? That we act of necessity, right? Is the way he puts it. So what we have in Hume is the formulation of what's called classical compatibilism, right? Again, that's called classical compatibilism. So to situate this with what we've been talking about in the rest of the course, we saw that with Descartes we have libertarianism, right? That we are free, that we're unmoved movers, at our most godlike we are free, or rather, in being free we are at our most godlike, right? So that was one end of the spectrum. Yesterday, in the past, we talked about Spinoza, right? For Spinoza, we aren't free, right? There is no such thing as free will. We are determined through and through. So there we have the other end of the spectrum. Sorry, I need to get my book flipped over here. We have the other end of the spectrum, right? Where we are thoroughly determined, no such thing as free will. Hume is in the middle, right? Hume wants to say, well, in some ways we're free, right? Or rather, we are free, right? And we are determined. It's just a matter of understanding these notions so that they are able to be reconciled with one another. And the way he does that is what we're going to talk about today. So, the big picture for Hume is that the concepts of both determinism and free will, or what he calls liberty and necessity, are necessary for our understanding of others as responsible agents. Right? So, in other words, we couldn't make sense of the idea of responsibility without the ideas of free will and of determinism. Right? So remember in a prior class, lecture, thingy, whatever the hell this is, we talked about the notion of conceptual dependence. So for Hume, the notion of responsibility, the concept of responsibility, depends on our concepts of liberty or free will and determinism or necessity. Now, his ideas about determinism, again sticking here with the big picture view, the idea of determinism is grounded in his analysis of causation, which we're going to talk about in just a hot second. Now, his view of free will, or his view of liberty, is about having the power to act or not according to your will. Right? And again, we'll talk about that in a smidge more detail in just a few minutes. So, we're first going to talk about the idea of necessity, or the idea of determinism for Hume. Now, I said just a moment ago that his views on determinism are grounded in his analysis of causation. Makes total sense. Remember how we talked about determinism, right? That a triggering event, that if a triggering event happens, then the triggered event must also happen. So the way we describe this is to say that when this happens, it causes this to happen, right? And this happens necessarily whenever this happens. So, Hume on cause is, well, it's a little bit funky, as we're going to see. So, let's go back to my trusty keys, right? So, I've got my keys, and I'm going to throw my keys. So I want to ask you the question, what caused my keys to fly through the air? And so, you're going to say, well, you're doing this, right? And the power of gravity, right? That caused your keys to fly through the air and land wherever they land, right? Fair enough. Hume's follow-up question is, okay, everything we know, we learn through observation, right? Remember, Hume is an empiricist, so that means there are no innate ideas. Everything we learn is through the senses. So Hume says, okay, so tell me this. Point out where you see cause, right? As soon as you see cause, shout it out. Right? And we can keep doing that. When I teach this in person, I do that like for 10 minutes. It's kind of fun. Okay, maybe not 10 minutes, but whatever. You get it. Um, uh, and Hume's point is that we never actually see cause at work, or we never actually see anything we would call a cause, right? What do you see, right? Like, strictly speaking, what do you see? Well, you see me doing this, right? You see keys going like this, and then eventually going out of the screen for you, but for me, they land on my book, so as to not make a great big racket. So we never actually see cause, right? We never perceive causal forces, right? We never see anything like causes and effects. What do we see? Well, we see one event after another, after another, after another. And Hume, in some other work, says that we get a notion of cause from this, or rather, more precisely, that we ascribe cause and effect relationships to events in the world as a matter of a mental habit, right? So we just get into the habit of describing the world in terms of cause and effect. But is there cause and effect really? No, right? We never perceive cause and effect, and so it doesn't exist, right? There is no such thing as cause and effect, because it's something about the world, but we never perceive it, right? It exists as a kind of a mental fiction for us, right? It makes our mental lives easier to think about the world in terms of cause and effect, but nonetheless, cause and effect isn't like a thing in the world, like my keys are a thing in the world. So what he describes this as is he uses the expression constant conjunction. And in fact, on page 89 in your text, he writes, our idea, therefore, so I'm sort of I don't know how this camera works, I don't know why I did that. I apologize for wasting 30 seconds of your time. About a quarter of the way down on page 89, he says, our idea, therefore, of necessity and causation arises entirely from the uniformity observable in the operations of nature, where similar objects are constantly conjoined together, and the mind is determined by custom, that is, by habit, to infer the one from the appearance from the other. These two circumstances form the whole of that necessity which we ascribe to matter, to things in the world. Beyond the constant conjunction of similar objects and the consequent inference from one to the other, we have no notion of any necessity or connection. So again, in other words, in like non-18th century Scottish language, all our ideas about cause and effect, it just comes from us seeing sort of similar things happening, right? When we perceive the keys flying through the air, I mean, it's sort of continuous or sort of discrete states all sort of stacked on top of one another, and each one is only minutely different from any other. Right? So that's all our idea of cause and effect is tiny, minute changes, one following the other. But all there is, right, this is the important point for Hume, all there is just the one event after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. There is no necessary connection among those events. There's only the one after the other after the other. So this means, on Hume's view, that there really is no such thing as cause and effect. There's only constant conjunction. So how does that apply to action? Well, Hume says that, or so Hume's position here is that what we find in constant conjunction are specific behaviors and people's motives. So, for example, if I steal candy from a baby, you might ask, why would I do that? Right? In other words, what's my motivation for doing that? My motivation is likely something like, or is probably something like, I want to see a baby cry. Or it might be because I'm asking myself, why the hell does a baby have candy? Or because, damn it, I just like taking things. Any one of these could be a motive for my behavior. But there are certain motives that are off the table as being sort of connected with this behavior. Right? So if I want to be a better student, right, stealing candy from a baby would have nothing to do with that. Or if if I wanted to propose to a significant other, then stealing candy from a baby would have very little, perhaps likely nothing to do with that. I mean, sure, you could stretch it, perhaps you could tell some really long, elaborate story about it, but once we do that, we make things a lot more complicated, right? You might say that I stole the candy from the baby so I could sell it to pay for the engagement ring, right? But in that case, my motive is, like, we'd probably say my motive is to pay for the engagement ring, right? Not just to steal the, not like a desire to see babies cry, right? Anyway, the point is that there's a constant conjunction between motives and behaviors. And so, again, on page 89, we find him saying, the constant and regular, we may possibly satisfy ourselves with the following consideration. It is universally acknowledged that there is a great uniformity among the actions of men and women in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains still the same in its principles and operations. The same motives always produce the same actions. The same events follow from the same causes. Ambition, avarice, self-love, vanity, friendship, generosity, public spirit, these passions, mixed in various degrees and distributed through society, have been, from the beginning of the world, and still are, the source of all actions and enterprises which have ever been observed among humanity. So we find, both in our experience and throughout all of history, the same motives powering the same behaviors. Okay, so one thing you might say to yourself is, well, surely there are exceptions to this, right? I mean, sometimes we find greedy people acting generously. Sometimes we find people who are typically kind being kind of peevish and annoyed, right? So for example, suppose you think of me as being largely kind and generous, right? Hypothetically speaking. And you find me being really short and testy one day. Well, how do we explain this? Well, we might explain this by suggesting that maybe Lassiter had a dental appointment, so he's in pain, or maybe he had a fight with a friend, or maybe he just got some bad news. So, does this undermine Hume's thesis? No, because we don't find strict regularities in the vast majority of nature, and so we shouldn't expect to find these strict regularities in human behavior, which is incredibly complex and complicated. I mean, you have things like keys traveling through space to land, right? That's a ridiculously simple example. As soon as you move up from that, you move into things like living organisms, things get a lot more complex, right? And we don't find the kind of strict regularity in the laws of physics that we find in living organisms. So, do people act differently on different days? Sure. But all that means is that there might be something there that we just don't know about. There's some motive that we are unaware of. Okay. So, you might notice that this determinism, this variety of determinism that we find in Hume, is different from the determinism we find in Spinoza. Recall that for Spinoza, we have God as the substance, and there are these intermediate attributes, and then there are these modes, right? And we are all manifestations of God. We all flow necessarily from God. We might describe that as a kind of universal determinism. That's not a thing, I just made it up, but it captures the idea nicely. Namely, that there's some feature of the universe that determines our behavior. Hume's determinism, however, doesn't come from God, it doesn't come from the Big Bang, it comes rather from our own motivations, right, from our own mental states, our own internal states. Now, this does have a name, I'm not making it up. This is called psychological determinism, right? In the end, the label is really easy to understand, right? We are determined in our actions because of our human psychology, right? We do what we do because of the motives that we have. So, variety of psychological determinism, right? We see how it's psychological. And I just want to make perfectly clear how it's also a variety of determinism. Because in all of our interactions with people, we tacitly assume this constant conjunction of motives and actions. Right? In fact, when I act out of character, the fact that you can identify my behavior as being out of character presupposes that there is this regularity, this uniformity between motives and actions. In fact, when we fail to find regularities between a person's motives and their actions, then we question the rationality of this person, right? We question the sanity of this person, right? Suppose I saw you, getting ready to grill some hamburgers, and I saw you, dousing the coals with water. Well, if you say to me, I'm trying to light the grill, right, and you're just dousing water, and you make perfectly obvious to me that you sincerely believe these things, right, that you're planning on cooking food and that you're actually making progress in dousing the coals with water, and you're not just screwing with me, then I'm going to question your rationality, right, and be like, dude, can't do that. So whenever we explain somebody's behavior by talking about their motives, what they want, we are tacitly assuming the truth of determinism, that motives lead to behavior. So that's the determinism part for Hume, right? That Hume offers us a psychological determinism, whereby we produce the actions we produce because of the motives that we have. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about Hume's ideas about freedom and